With the shilling of Pal World in full force, I thought it was about time that we really take a step back and kind of talk about what's been happening when it comes to these random meme games, as I call them. PC exclusives, usually, that come out, usually at reduced prices, that kind of take the internet by storm for like a brief couple of weeks. They're the biggest thing ever for the month, and then they just kind of fall off the face of the earth, right? We saw this with Temtem. We saw this with we're seeing this now with Power World. It is kind of a reoccurring thing with the PC gaming community where every single time they think they can get away with it, they'll declare one of their games, some random game from some no-name developer that nobody cares about, as like a Nintendo franchise killer. Whether it's Zelda or Mario or Pokemon, they're always going to come out and try to pretend as if these games have a massive audience on PC. You know, they're going to pretend that if Nintendo put their games on PC, they would sell like 1 billion units and like people would never ever buy their hardware again. You know, like you have people pushing that narrative, right? That these games showcase how popular Nintendo games are on the PC platform, and that Nintendo should put their franchises on PC. You know, never mind that Nintendo makes a ton of money on their hardware and software. You know, never mind that they're highly successful at doing that. Never mind that they have no business doing that, that they have nothing but that they have everything to lose if they went in that direction. Let's just pretend that Nintendo would be better off putting games on PC. It is disgusting, right? And it seems like every time a Power World comes out, every time a Baldur's Gate 3 comes out, every time like an Elden Ring comes out, like the PC gaming community is there, you know, releasing statements about how Nintendo can't compete with this, how they're stale and outdated, how their hardware can't run these games, and how like, you know, random developers are going to step up and they're going to make like things that stomp all of these classic Nintendo IPs. You know, I've seen these people like hype up freeware Fire Emblem games from the series creator. I've seen people like hype up fan translations, fan patches, fan remakes. You know, we saw this with the Samus Returns remake, right? The Metroid 2 remake. I've seen people like just scream about how Nintendo isn't any good, and that's why they need to release all their games on PC so they don't have to emulate them anymore. Like that's funny, isn't it? Like the narrative is always that the PC master race is just going to emulate all these Nintendo games, but they also are very insistent that Nintendo should release their games on Steam. So which is it, buddy? Like, are you playing all these games or not? It's laughable, but what's been happening with Power World is a pretty typical thing from that community, from the Pretendo YouTube sphere, right? Like every single time one of these meme games come out, like the community rallies behind it. They really, really, really want to see whatever Nintendo is doing fail. Whether it's like promoting an alternative to Fire Emblem or some other random platformer other than Mario or whatever, right? You know, I remember when Sonic Team Racing came out, and there were seriously people pushing this idea that it was better than Mario Kart 8. Of course, that is, of course, in hindsight, like completely laughable, considering how relevant Mario Kart 8 has remained over the past decade. Well, Sonic hasn't been discussed at all. You know, like Jontron said, Sonic and Sega plagiarism cart. But when you look back at like just the sheer gaslighting that goes on in these communities, like how they try to convince you that Power World is some unique, innovative thing that's doing everything that fans wanted Pokemon to do. You know, one of the big things I'm hearing people say is that like, oh, you can ride your Pokemon. You've been able to do that since the beginning, right? Have you never heard of surf? Like, bro, it's kind of a standard thing when it comes to Pokemon, right? Like, oh, you can craft. Don't you remember the Pokeball crafting in Gen 2, right? Where you go to Kurt with like the specific apricots and like, do you not remember, like, do you not know anything about Pokemon at all, is what I'm saying. Like, that's the trend I notice whenever I see people like praise stuff like this. Is that like you can't even do the thing where you pretend that like, oh, it's a big innovative new direction for Pokemon, because Game Freak already did that with Legends Arceus, which to this day is still a game that isn't generally accepted among the community to be great. Like, people don't want to admit that, like, Legends Arceus was fantastic. My personal game of the year 2022. It was, such a big evolution for the Game Freak Pokemon model. I loved that game. And yet you won't see people talk about it. Oh, that's right. That's another game that you can ride Pokemon on, isn't it? Ridiculous. Like, Power World is interesting because there's all these obvious problems with it, like the plagiarism and the glitchiness, the fact that it's in early access. Like, this is going to be a repeat of Temtem for sure, where a lot of YouTubers release all these statements that, like, oh, I'm enjoying this a lot more than Pokemon, even though they don't play Pokemon. Like, they're going to do all this stuff that they always do, and then it's going to fall by the wayside, right? It's amazing seeing people, like, kind of cling on to, like, the alleged player counts and the sales. Like, oh, it has 900,000 players at once. Nobody cares, okay? Nobody cares. I do think this needs to be the thing that's said about, like, every time that the topic of PC player counts comes up, is that nobody cares. Talk about the actual game. And nobody seems to do that, right? Like, that's the thing that really sticks out to me about Power World, specifically at this point in time, is that nobody is talking about the game. They're talking about how Pokemon is dead and how Game Freak isn't going to be able to compete with this. Never mind that they're going to have another gen in the pipeline in a couple of years. Never mind that they could easily just commission some other studio to make a game that is kind of open worldish with multiple players and Pokemon and stuff like that. Like, never mind that, like, the Pokemon company is having lots of success stories, right? No, let's push this narrative that, like, Power World is way, way above what Pokemon is doing, even though it's, like, blatantly plagiarized and it isn't doing anything particularly new or innovative. Let us just pretend that this is some top-tier game simply to spite Nintendo fans. And that is what this essentially comes down to, is that this is pure spite. It has nothing to do with, like, enjoying the product or being enthusiastic about the product or, like, enjoying the game or anything like that. Like, the reason the game is being hyped up so much is because this is probably the last stand of the anti-Pokemon community on YouTube, right? After Gen 8, there was, like, this very real push to kind of destroy Pokemon, destroy its reputation in the online space, and it never really stuck, right? It completely fell off once Sword and Shield came out and were great games, right? And ever since then, there's been, like, definitely a push to bring it back. Definitely a push to keep the narrative going, but it's been falling apart more and more every year, right? It feels like every time that Game Freak puts out a new Pokemon game and it does higher and higher numbers, like, it becomes more and more difficult to pretend that the audience is upset with this, right? The people who are upset with Pokemon aren't the audience. I've talked about this several times, but, if the primary group of people who are complaining about your game are 30-year-old man children, right? When your game is targeted towards, like, 10-year-olds, right, that these people aren't relevant to the discussion, right? That these guys are a fringe demographic, and as a result, you should not listen to them. And I think Game Freak is doing a very wise thing in just kind of doing what they've always done and sticking to their guns and producing new and interesting Pokemon games, right? Like, I don't think that any of the points raised about Game Freak, about their alleged lack of visual quality, about, like, the alleged quality assurance of the game, about, like, the features, the mechanics, like, everything about that. Like, I don't think any of those arguments really holds any merit at all. Like, every time I see a new Game Freak game, like, I enjoy it, right? Like, I love what Game Freak is doing right now. And to me, I think the major difference between Tears of the Kingdom and Pokemon is that Pokemon is in a position where people actually believe that, like, the arguments against it might have some merit, right? I suppose it's really similar to what happened in, like, the GameCube and Wii era of Zelda, where people were saying that, like, oh, Zelda's lost its way, it's declining quality, even though that was never actually true. Like, a lot of casual fans and, like, people who didn't play the games believed it, right? Because like, whoa, if it was as good, it would like sell more, right? And now that we're seeing that like Tears of the Kingdom sell more than ever, outselling a lot of major fantasy RPGs, these same people are just flailing around, just crying about how Nintendo fanboys will buy anything, right? Like that isn't gonna stick, right? And I think it's gonna be the same deal with Pokemon, right? Like I think it's safe to say that Power World isn't gonna be relevant long term. Like I think the novelty is going to wear off. People aren't going to be able to like weaponize it against Pokemon anymore. And when that happens, the game simply will have no audience. Because that's what this is all about. It has nothing to do with wanting to play this game. It has everything to do with talking down to a video game IP that is made for young children.